Hello, Martin Kelly, the Quaker ranter here, and I'd like to talk a little bit today about forgeries. Yes, forgeries. I was reading an interesting article, and I think it's apropos, so bear with me. We'll get into some other stuff in a moment. But it was talking about a forger, a painting forger, in the mid-20th century, who painted all these wonderful reproductions of lost Dutch masters. So he would paint Vermeer that supposedly was out there, and he would get it out into the markets, and people would spend millions of dollars for these paintings. All the world's experts would say, oh yes, yes, this is definitely a Vermeer. You can tell from this, 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 and this, and this. This fellow got so good and had so many fake Dutch masters that there were actually sort of, this is Vermeer's middle period, this series of paintings from the forger. The forger became, almost in a way, the Dutch masters himself. What was interesting, though, about this is that as the years progressed, the forgeries became obvious to anyone with an expert's eye, an artistic eye, that 10 years, 20 years down the road, everyone could see that this was actually a painting done in the 1940s in the style of an old Dutch master. That there were certain characteristics, elements, styles that were so much a part of the culture that a painter in 1940 would weave them in even without thinking about it, even while trying to be an old Dutch master. And critics and experts couldn't even see it. It was so much part of the flow of life of what we do as moderns and how we see paintings that they couldn't even see. And so it became this kind of funny situation that 10 years, 20 years down the road, any even small expert could just look at these paintings and go, ha ha ha, someone thought that these were an old Dutch masters. So where does this lead? Well, this leads to sort of thinking about how we are embedded in our moment and how sometimes we can see the sort of older things and the newer things and the more eternal things because we are so embedded in our current moment, and there's just certain things we can't see. So I'm saying all this as a sort of plug and as a rationale to show you why I read sometimes old testimonies. Now, I don't own an antiquarian bookstore. There are Quakers who do, and we can put their URLs down, maybe, perhaps. But I don't. Why I do this is because some of the current testimonies, when I read them, I don't get much out of them. Maybe it's because I've been a peace activist for 20 years, since college. So I hear peace and I read like a standard Quaker thing, current thing about peace, and I just go blah, blah, blah. I mean, I've seen all this. I've read all this. I've written all this. There's nothing sort of new, nothing that jumps out at me. Things don't have to have a novelty, but I don't really find I learn much from this because I think I know peace, and I'm writing something that knows peace, and it's using so much my language that I don't get anything new from it. And the same with all the other sort of modern testimonies. But I put it in quotes because most yearly meetings haven't actually minuted those things that we currently call the testimonies, the SPICE testimonies: simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. Actually, on my yearly meeting, Faith and Practice only has like one little line in the Faith and Practice mentioning them. But they have become the de facto testimonies of at least liberal Quakers today. So, but as I said, when I read them, I don't actually get much out of them. And yet when I then go and I pick up an old discipline, you know, here's an old one, and I'll actually show you something more relevant that you can go out and buy. You don't have to go to the antiquarian bookstore. This is The Old Discipline, which was produced fairly recently by Quaker Heritage Press, and it is, much of this is online. If you go and type into Google Quaker Heritage Press Old Discipline, you'll find it has a copy of the 1806, I think, Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, Faith and Practice, Book of Discipline. Very interesting. One thing you'll notice is that none of the SPICE things actually shows up. You know, you're looking like, where's simplicity? And it's not there. Where's peace? It's not there. Where's integrity? It's not there. Because they didn't use these terms. All of those elements are there in the book, but not under those names. So that's the first sort of like, well, what were they thinking? How could they be Quaker if they don't believe in simplicity and peace and all that kind of stuff? So helps get you out of, the current rut that some of us, I mean, I'll admit that I'm sometimes in when I read the current stuff. So, here we'll go and we'll see, instead of peace, we're having here war. War. Listed as a testimony. And when it explains why you should be against war, it's not using always exactly the same rationales as I see in current things, and it helps get me out of today's kind of I know what peace is all about rut. It's not really that it's against the current peace testimony as we formulate it, but it's kind of frames it in a different way that to me makes it, gives me insights to understand sort of where this peace testimony came from. It's not just that we're a bunch of peace activists who are Quakers, but there's sort of a reason for this. And the only other thing I'd like to say, though, is that the old testimonies sometimes get a bum rap. And we're talking online, some of us here, about the testimony on plainness, and the point was brought up and is often brought up that Quakers had this strict uniform and they weren't understanding things, and they were forced to dress a certain way, and the testimony on simplicity is much better because it doesn't have those specific kind of things going for them. And what you find, though, if you read the old disciplines, is that they're not nearly as kind of cartoonish as that. And in fact, if you look up the testimony on plainness, it's all about the sort of mindset of simplicity in many ways, and how we need to be humble, and how we can't do things just because that's we shouldn't do things for show, and we shouldn't talk one way to certain people and talk a different way to certain people, that we should be consistent in how we show ourselves in the world. And it's not nearly the kind of stereotyped, you have to dress with a certain kind of button kind of way that we sometimes think it is. And that a lot of the old friends weren't like that. I was recently reading a historian's account that was talking about the plain dress, and they said that plain dress wasn't nearly the kind of uniform that we sometimes stereotypically say it was, that Quakers didn't have a certain, very precise styles that they had to dress in, and that these precise styles that we have actually came about from 20th century Quaker reenactors who would dress up as old-time Quakers for their meeting anniversary, and that these reenactors had, developed very specific, like, oh, you need this certain kind of broad fall belt, and you need this certain kind of bonnet, and that it was the reenactors who actually sort of set those standards and got really, fidgety if anyone crossed those boundaries. But there were times, certainly, when Quakers got too obsessed with dress, and there are times when Quakers get too obsessed with everything. But if you go back to the old testimonies, the minuted, here's what we believe testimonies, and again, here's a modern book that you can actually buy or download parts of it. If you go back there, you'll find that it's much more nuanced, and can sometimes get you outside of the sort of we know what peace and community and all that is, because it sort of gives it to you in a different way. So there you go, a little bit about Dutch masters and forgery and being embedded in our culture, and a little plug for picking up some old books and giving them a once through and seeing what they actually might say. Thanks again. Peace. QuakerRanter.org. Talk to you later. Bye.